A bill that would radically change the way Vermont runs elections, including a provision that would automatically mail out live ballots to all active voters on the statewide voter checklist, regardless of request, has passed the Vermont Senate and is on its way to the House. Here's what you need to know about this bill and why we think it's tremendously dangerous to the integrity of future election results. The nonpartisan 2005 Commission on Federal Election Reform, co-chaired by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James A. Baker, noted that because it takes place outside the regulated environment of local polling locations, voting by mail creates increased logistical challenges and the potential for vote fraud, especially if safeguards are lacking. As we'll see, this Vermont bill has virtually no safeguards in place. No way of knowing, let alone tracing and prosecuting fraud if and when it occurs. In testimony taken earlier this year, Vermont's Director of Elections, Will Senning, admitted to this fact in questioning by Senator Brian Collmore.
But if I were to have filled out my wife's ballot and or my son's, which arrived without them asking, in other words, they didn't request them through the absentee ballot process, but they just arrived, what security measures are in place now whereby we could have even known that, let alone, remedied it and prosecuted me, quite frankly?
So you fill out their ballot for them, put it in that certificate envelope, and sign their name for them in some kind of manner that you plan will not be noticed by your town clerk as looking too much like your signature that also comes in with your own ballot. It's likely that ballot will get processed and that your wife and or your son would be checked off the checklist as having voted at that point.
Similar admissions from town and city clerks took place in the House Government Operations Committee.
So the question is, could you catch an individual who signed a ballot for another individual that was debilitated to some degree, or whatever the case might be?
John Odom.
I mean, the short answer to the question is no, we can't necessarily stop.
If someone was determined to do that type of fraud, there's nothing now stopping them from requesting an absentee ballot on behalf of that voter and doing it at home.
So what, for example, if it's someone who votes for somebody who just doesn't want to vote, how is what if that's what's happening?
I was just going to say that there at this stage of the game there isn't any way in our current system that would preclude somebody making a request and then voting on behalf of someone who doesn't want to vote. That is, as we've talked about, whether you're mailing ballots out to people or whether you're mailing them upon request, that is an opportunity that's out there.
Now, what this means is that if someone gets hold of a ballot for someone who chooses not to vote in the election because they moved away or just don't care, it's impossible for election officials to detect this, and the votes will be processed without question. This, of course, creates a dangerous environment for potential fraud by individuals committing one or a few crimes of temptation, such as when an errant ballot for the previous resident shows up in their mailbox, or in voting for a spouse, elderly parent, or disinterested friend or relative who chooses not to vote, or by well-funded, organized political groups acting more systematically, actively collecting unwanted or unclaimed ballots, filling them out, and sending them in. Now let's look at some of the numbers to see just how much of an opportunity like this would be out there if this bill becomes law. In the 2020 general election, there were over 506,000 registered voters in Vermont. Only about 371,000 votes were actually cast. That means there were over 135,000 unclaimed and unwanted live ballots floating around the state. Of these 371,000 votes that were cast, just over 280,000 were cast absentee, or 76%. This creates a very large universe, the blue and red pieces of the pie chart, for potential voter fraud. If you believe the clerks in the Vermont Directorate of Elections, we have a situation in which they have no way of knowing or verifying whether or not 76% of ballots cast in 2020 were cast legitimately or fraudulently. If the fraud number turned out to be just 5%, that would mean over 14,000 fraudulent votes. And under this law, we will never, can never, know for sure how small or how large that number really is. When you consider the number of local elections and state house and senate races won and lost by a handful of votes, in 2020 the Vermont Speaker of the House lost her seat by just 20 votes, you see how potent the potential for mischief really is. How can Vermonters have confidence in the reliability of such a system?
Phone call. Good morning. You're on the Morning Drive with Secretary of State Jim Condos.
How do we take voters off the rolls? Because my son has been registered in Vermont, in Burlington, for 2 years, but I just got a town meeting ballot for him in Milton. My daughter has been registered in Brooklyn, New York, for 6 years, and her ballots still come here. Now, secondly, real quick, harvesting doesn't mean they bring them to the town clerks. In Middlebury, I own an apartment building, and there were about 25 ballots for the presidential election by all the by the mailboxes in the hallway, and the college kids scooped them all up, voted them all, and put them all in the mailbox. So don't tell me it's not happening.
There are other states that mail ballots to voters, but they have serious and strenuous security measures in place to prevent fraud that Vermont, at least so far, refuses to adopt. What are some of these security measures? 1. Mandatory signature verification. States that rely primarily on vote by mail require that voters sign their ballot return envelope, and that signature must match the signature of the voter held on file by election officials. This is just one option for a voter ID process that allows election officials to confirm that the vote being counted actually belongs to the voter to whom it is being attributed. 2. Prohibition of ballot harvesting, the controversial and often abused practice of allowing non-election officials to collect and return absentee ballots, sometimes leading to collectors putting inappropriate pressure on voters to vote in a certain way, collectors destroying ballots for candidates they don't like, or falsifying ballots to reflect their own preferences rather than the voters. And 3, they vigorously purge voter rolls of ineligible voters to make sure that there aren't all those unwanted, unclaimed ballots floating around out there that are the low-hanging fruit for fraud. There are other vulnerabilities in Vermont's voter laws too, such as same-day voter registration.
I keep saying on election day, after people register to vote on election day, I send them all a notice saying, welcome to the city, and you've been new voter. And there have been some presidential elections that I'll get 15 to 20 of them back. It's not at this address. Now, it could be the post office not wanting to deliver, or it could be the fact that no one really truly lives there.
With same-day voter, we don't have the time for the mail to come back and find out that they're not really there.
Now, proponents of Vermont's see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil election policies will argue that committing fraud is illegal and comes with severe penalties if caught. And this is enough to dissuade any and all from tampering with absentee ballots. Now, I think we all know that this is naive at best and dishonest at worst. So I'll leave you with this thought. It's also illegal, a property crime, to steal, deface, or destroy political lawn signs. But we all know it happens all the time. Sometimes these are crimes of temptation, and sometimes they're planned and systematic. I would safely speculate that the level of tampering with absentee ballots is probably on par with the level of tampering with political lawn signs. Perhaps more so, because lawn signs are at least by definition in highly visible locations, and absentee ballot fraud takes place entirely in the shadows. But until we have election laws that allow for transparent, verifiable procedures that accurately identify valid voters and disallow fraudulent voters from participating in elections, we can't know for sure.
So really, what we need to do to find fraud is to make it so we don't disenfranchise people, but we also got to find ways to make it that the information that we're getting is verifiable. I guess that's the correct word.